When you sit down to read a last will and testament, you expect absolute precision.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's dry, it's binding, it's just filled with legalese. You don't read a contract that's allocating like $1 billion corporate estate and say, wow, what a lovely poetic metaphor about asset distribution.
Right, you would be laughed right out of probate court. A legal contract is a mechanism.
Exactly.
Does a specific, highly regulated job, and every single word has a definable, actionable boundary.
But then you open ancient biblical texts, right, specifically the book of Genesis, and suddenly everyone just puts on their poetry glasses.
Yeah, they really do.
We treat these incredibly precise legal redistributions of land, power, and authority like they're just mystical campfire stories meant to impart warm moral feeling.
Which is a massive mistake.
Right. So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are looking at a concept you have probably heard of, the blessing of Abraham.
But we're looking at it completely differently.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to completely strip away the fog of translation. We are taking a massive stack of sources today.
Yeah, intense theological analysis, ancient linguistics.
Dead Sea Scroll research, and even formal mathematical logic.
Which is wild.
It is wild. We are going to uncover an ancient legal mechanism hiding in plain sight by looking at these texts not as poetry, but as a precise mathematical constitution. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, the material we are diving into today completely reorients how you read these texts. I mean, we are looking at a strict legal contract that fractured, creating a constitutional crisis that the rest of the historical text is frantically trying to solve.
And before we get to the mechanics of that crisis, I need to look right at you, the listener, and lay down some ground rules.
Good call.
Yeah, because treating these texts as a mechanical constitutional framework touches on some incredibly explosive political and theological territory.
It really does.
Our sources today brush up against Christian Zionism, the ideological justifications for the British Empire, debates over modern political Israel, and, competing orthodoxies between Jewish and Christian traditions.
Very heavy topics.
Very heavy. So I want to be crystal clear. Our goal today is not to take a theological side or endorse any of those modern political movements. None of them.
Right.
We are strictly and impartially acting as your guides. We're just reporting on the fascinating structural ideas contained in the original source material.
We're just looking at the math and the law.
Just the math and the law.
And that framing is essential, really, because the original text was profoundly concerned by law. To understand the constitutional crisis, we have to look at how the foundational contract was deliberately broken apart.
Right. So let's go to Genesis 49.
Yes.
Yeah.
Genesis 49. Jacob is on his deathbed, surrounded by his 12 sons. Now, most conventional readings treat this as a dying father giving personalized poetic blessings to his kids.
Like a nice little send-off.
Right. But the sources we're analyzing today argue it is actually a formal judicial proceeding. Jacob is legally redistributing a covenantal monopoly.
Okay, let's define that monopoly. Originally, the Abrahamic blessing was one unified package, right?
Yes.
It contained land, sovereign authority, and spiritual priesthood. It was all held by one patriarch.
It was completely centralized. But Jacob realizes that centralization has failed.
So what does he do?
Well, first, he strips the primary birthright from his firstborn, Reuben, due to a severe moral failure.
Oh, right. Reuben had slept with his father's concubine.
Exactly, which in the ancient world wasn't just a familial betrayal, it was a strict legal violation of the patriarch's authority.
So Reuben is out.
Reuben is out. Then Jacob skips over the next two sons, Simeon and Levi.
Because of the massacre.
Yes. He curses them for their unauthorized violent massacre at the city of Shechem. He explicitly declares they will be scattered.
Okay, so he's disqualified the top three heirs.
Right. And having done that, Jacob takes this unified monopoly and violently fractures it into three distinct, separated streams.
I want to make sure we clearly understand those three streams because, this is the engine for everything else we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. So the first stream is the kingship, the scepter.
Okay.
Jacob gives this exclusively to Judah. The text explicitly states the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes.
Until Shiloh comes.
Right. That operates as a permanent transfer of royal sovereign authority to one specific tribe.
Got it. And the second stream.
The second stream is the birthright. This encompasses the double portion of physical land and economic prosperity.
And that goes to Joseph.
It goes to Joseph, but Jacob legally maneuvers to split it between Joseph's two sons Ephraim and Manasseh.
Okay, so that's two streams down.
And finally, the third stream is the priesthood. This is eventually allocated to Levi, functioning almost as a legal compensation for being cursed and scattered among the other tribes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they get no land, but they get the altar.
Okay, so hearing this, it makes me think of like a dying CEO who built this massive unified monopoly of a company.
Yeah, exactly.
But on his deathbed, he realizes that giving all that power to one single heir is far too dangerous. I mean, it corrupts them.
Right. Absolute power corrupts.
Right, so he initiates a hostile restructuring. He splits the monopoly into three completely separate companies. Operations goes to one kid, finance to another, and HR to a third. He legally ensures no single person holds all the power ever again.
That corporate restructuring analogy perfectly captures the mechanism at play here. It establishes a strict separation of powers.
And I imagine that creates some problems.
Huge problems. This separation creates a lasting constitutional tension throughout the rest of the historical text. You have the royal scepter down south in Judah and the economic birthright up north in Joseph's territory.
The two separate companies.
Right. And later prophets clearly recognize this legal tension. Ezekiel has a famous two sticks prophecy where he holds the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and he explicitly declares that these separated offices must eventually be reunited under one single Davidic king. The original legal contract inherently demands eventual reunification.
Which brings up a massive question for me.
Okay?
If this constitutional structure, this brilliant separation of powers, is so mathematically precise in the original Hebrew text, why is it completely invisible to most modern readers? I mean, why did I grow up thinking these were just nice poems about lions and fruitful branches?
That is the million-dollar question. And the obscuring of that legal framework lies almost entirely in the politics of empire and the weaponization of translation.
Wait, really? Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Are you saying King James and early translators basically hijacked the dictionary to make their own empires look like the chosen people? Because that is a very heavy accusation.
I am. The historical record shows a deliberate translation tradition feedback loop that did exactly that.
Give me an example.
Let's examine the King James Version and the earlier Geneva Bible. When Jacob blesses Ephraim in the original Hebrew, he decrees that his descendants will become Melohagoim.
Melohagoim.
Right. Linguistically, that translates to the fullness of peoples. It implies an integrated composite whole, like a melting pot of nations coming together into one legal entity.
But I'm guessing the King James Bible does not say fullness of peoples.
It does not. It renders it as a multitude of nations.
Okay, that sounds slightly different, but why is that a big deal?
Because changing fullness of peoples to multitude of nations wasn't just a stylistic choice. It perfectly justified the prevailing ideology that the British Empire was the literal biblical Ephraim, divinely appointed to colonize and rule over a scattered multitude of subordinate nations.
Wow.
Yeah. They altered a phrase about internal integration into a divine mandate for global colonization.
That is wild. They literally rewrote the contract to put themselves in the will.
They absolutely did. And they applied the same tactic to Joseph. The Hebrew text describes Joseph as Ben Porat.
Ben Porat.
Yes. This phrase implies intensive dynamic fruitfulness, using imagery of daughters actively running over walls and breaking through boundaries.
Very active.
Very active. But the King James flattens this into a fruitful bough with branches.
They botanicalized it.
They botanicalized it.
They took a radical, boundary-breaking family dynamic and turned it into a passive, static plant. I'm guessing because a fruitful bough with subordinate branches perfectly supports a rigid, top-down ecclesiastical hierarchy like the Anglican Church.
You nailed it. That is the exact political utility of that translation. It completely erases the dynamic Hebrew legal imagery.
Unbelievable.
And this practice predates the Reformation by centuries, by the way. The Latin Vulgate engaged in the same institutional mapping.
Really? The Vulgate, too?
Oh, yeah. Remember that key word for Judah's scepter? Shiloh.
Yeah, until Shiloh comes.
Right. Well, the Vulgate translated it into a Latin missional phrase, qui mittendus est, which means he who is to be sent.
Let me guess. To support papal Roman universalism and the sending of missionaries.
Exactly. The translation shifts the focus from a specific legal heir claiming a royal scepter to an institutional mandate for the church to send emissaries.
Wow.
These accumulating translation choices completely obscured the precise legal framework. They turned a tight, self-terminating constitutional document into generic, poetic, tribal blessings that any rising empire could easily claim for themselves.
Okay, so if we clear away all that translation fog, the KJV, the Vulgate, and we just look at the raw legal contract, the ancients knew this monopoly had been fractured.
Yes, they did.
But they didn't just leave it open-ended. I mean, a contract needs terms and it needs an expiration date.
It has one.
Yeah.
The book of Daniel provides the chronological lock for this contract. Daniel chapter 9 outlines a strict 70-week or 490-year countdown.
490 years.
Right, and this wasn't a vague prophecy. It came with 6 specific, measurable terminal conditions that had to be met when the timer hit 0.
Like what?
Conditions like finishing transgression, making an end of sin, and anointing the most holy.
So what does this all mean? Instead of an abstract prophecy, we should think of this like a massive financial bond reaching maturity.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Everyone knows the exact payout date, but all the heirs are just fighting over who actually holds the valid bearer bond. And we know for a fact that ancient people were actively tracking this maturity date, right?
We have the historical receipts. The Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically a document known as the 11 Melchizedek scroll found at Qumran, proved that pre-Christian Jewish communities were actively computing this 490-year timeline.
They're doing the math.
They were doing the math. They calculated it out to exactly 10 jubilees. Based on their math, they fully expected a priestly, kingly Messiah to arrive and reunify the separated offices in their own immediate generation.
Wow. What's fascinating here is that the controversy between early Jewish and Christian traditions isn't really a debate about how to read poetry or hermeneutics.
No, not at all.
They both saw the exact same constitutional structure. They both agreed on the math. It was a literal computational war over when the bond matured and who had the legal right to cash it in.
Exactly. It's basically like every ancient faction was holding the exact same alarm clock, but they were all fiercely debating what time zone they were in.
The time zone.
And the Septuagint, which was the primary Greek translation of the Old Testament used in the first century, computed the timeline to end right around 33 CE.
33 CE. That's a very specific and familiar date.
The implications of that date were obviously explosive given the rise of the early Christian movement. So in response to this, later rabbinic scholars formulated the Seder Olam.
What's the Seder Olam?
It's a chronological work that deliberately compressed historical timelines. They literally erased roughly 160 years of the Persian Empire from their historical records.
Wait, they just deleted a century and a half of history?
Yes. By shrinking history, they forced the 490-year countdown to end in 70 CE, aligning it with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans.
Oh my gosh. They altered the historical time zone so the alarm clock wouldn't ring on Jesus of Nazareth. That is a massive institutional countermove.
It really is.
So the first century arrives. The 490 years are up one way or another. This fractured constitutional monopoly of scepter, birthright, and priesthood legally has to be resolved. How did the intellectual heavyweights of the ancient world handle the crisis?
Well, our sources identify 5 distinct trajectories, which were essentially 5 different crisis response strategies.
Okay, lay them out for me.
The first strategy was apocalyptic deferment. Communities like Qumran looked at the broken system and computed the math to expect a future, almost cosmic figure who would magically descend to combine the offices.
Right, so if you can't solve it now, just push it into the future.
Precisely. The second strategy came from Philo of Alexandria. Operating in a deeply Hellenistic philosophical environment, Philo simply allegorized the entire legal problem away. He argued the 12 tribes weren't actual legal entities or historical families. He said they were merely philosophical soul faculties. He dissolved a hard constitutional crisis into personal psychology.
Which is a very convenient way to avoid a real-world legal nightmare. Just say the contract is entirely in your head.
Exactly. Now, the third strategy was argued by Josephus, the famous first-century historian. He essentially argued for historical expiration.
Expiration?
Yeah, he claimed the tribal offices simply ended when the Roman legions burned Jerusalem. The contract didn't need to be fulfilled, it was just voided by conquest.
The company went bankrupt, so the CEO's will doesn't matter anymore.
Exactly. The fourth trajectory was the later rabbinic response, which institutionalized the separation. They looked at the constitutional tension between Judah and Joseph and concluded the math required 2 distinct messiahs.
2 messiahs.
Yes, a Messiah ben Joseph, representing the northern birthright, who would suffer and die in an apocalyptic battle, and a Messiah ben David, representing Judah's scepter, who would subsequently reign as a victorious king.
Okay, so they looked at the separated companies of operations and finance and decided they had to remain separate forever.
Right.
Which brings us to the 5th trajectory.
The Pauline, or Christian trajectory. The Apostle Paul and the early Christian writers claimed juridical fulfillment. They argued that the separated offices of scepter, birthright, and priesthood were finally legally reunified in one single person.
And if you read the New Testament through this legal lens, suddenly the arguments make so much more sense. I mean, the letter to the Hebrews spends chapters making this complex legal argument that Jesus is from the tribe of Judah, so he legally holds the scepter.
Right.
But Levi's priesthood is mortal and tied to the fractured system. So Hebrews argues Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek.
An older pre-fracture priesthood.
Exactly. It legally supersedes Levi. He's utilizing a legal loophole to combine the separated streams.
Building on that, Paul takes this juridical argument a massive step further in Romans 11 with his famous metaphor of the olive tree.
Oh, I've heard this one.
Modern readers usually interpret this as a generic theological statement about non-Jewish Gentiles joining the church. But in the original context, the wild olive branches being grafted in explicitly represent Ephraim's lost birthright, the Melo HaGoyim.
The fullness of the nations. But wait, how does a botanical metaphor equal a legal contract, though?
Because in Roman law and in ancient Near Eastern property law, grafting wasn't just gardening. It was a recognized metaphor for legal adoption and the merging of estates.
Oh, wow.
By grafting the wild branches of Ephraim back into the natural root of Judah, Paul is arguing for the legal reunification of the contract. The lost birthright is legally readopted into the sovereign root.
I have to point out an observation from our sources here that completely blew my mind about Paul himself.
Go for it.
Throughout his letters, Paul constantly reminds his readers that he is from the tribe of Benjamin.
Yes, he does.
Why does he care so much about this specific genealogical detail? Well, if you look at an ancient tribal map, Benjamin is the literal geographic and genealogical buffer tribe. It's located directly between Judah in the south and Joseph in the north.
Right.
Paul, as a Benjaminite, is positioning himself as the literal, living, legal bridge between the two fractured halves of the contract.
It is a brilliant piece of juridical positioning. Paul isn't just a preacher, he's acting as the executor of the estate. And this proves that when Paul talks about the hardening of Israel, he is describing a graded constitutional displacement.
A displacement.
Yes. Simeon and Levi were permanently scattered by Jacob's deathbed curse. Judah's authority was temporarily suspended, put in a state of legal hardening until the heir, Shiloh, arrives. It's a precise legal status for each individual tribe, not just a generic complaint about spiritual unbelief.
Okay, this brings us to the final and maybe most mind-bending part of our deep dive. We've talked about contracts, bonds, and constitutional law. But if the Bible is actually operating as a strict mathematical framework, can we prove it? Like formal logic, theorem-proving style?
We actually can map it logically. If we treat the biblical text like a mathematical theorem, we can establish the axioms based on everything we've discussed.
Okay, let's hear the axioms.
Axiom 1. The original blessing is a unified monopoly. Axiom 2. Jacob fractures it into separate powers. Axiom 3. Prophetic law demands reunification. Axiom 4. A 490-year timer governs the resolution. Axiom 5. The heir must possess both the eternal scepter and an eternal priesthood.
Sounds solid.
But here is the massive logical trap.
The problem of mortality.
Exactly.
In contract law, death legally terminates human authority. A power of attorney expires the second the person dies. You cannot hold an eternal kingship or an eternal priesthood if you are dead.
You can't. Therefore, axiom 6 of this theorem is the resurrection. When Paul writes in his first letter to the Corinthians that if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless and so is your faith, he is not making a spiritual plea for hope. He is stating a cold, hard, legal fact.
The legal necessity.
Without the resurrection, the Messiah's authority is terminated by death. If he dies and stays dead, he breaches the contract, the office is separate again, and the entire legal framework is void.
It's like finding the final elusive variable in an impossible algebraic equation. You know, you have this massive complex formula spanning thousands of years with dozens of moving parts. And the resurrection is the one single variable that suddenly makes the entire massive equation balance out to zero. It solves the math.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it means the early Christian claim is inherently falsifiable. It is not presented as a blind leap of faith. It is an epistemological argument based on constitutional law that absolutely requires a valid living executioner to hold the scepter and the priesthood simultaneously.
And the book of Revelation at the very end of the Bible is basically the model theory proving the math actually works.
That's right. If you look at the famous tribal lists in Revelation chapter 7, they are not random. They explicitly exclude the tribes of Dan and Ephraim.
Why are they excluded?
Because historically, those tribes engaged in systemic idolatry, which legally breached the terms of the covenant. But functionally, to keep the mathematical structure balanced at 12, the text replaces them with Manasseh and Joseph.
The math stays balanced.
Exactly. And sitting at the center of this newly balanced equation is the Lamb. The text explicitly calls him the Lion of Judah, holding the scepter, while he functions in the heavenly temple as the eternal Melchizedekian priest. The fractured monopoly is finally merged.
Man, it completely changes how you read the text.
It really does.
Whether you approach these ancient documents from a place of deep personal faith, or if you are just listening to this as an insanely curious student of history, viewing the Bible not just as moral poetry, but as a precise, self-terminating legal and mathematical constitution, it shifts everything. Once you see the machinery, you can never unsee it.
The math is always humming just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to clear away the translation fog and actually look at the equations.
And that brings us to one final provocative thought for you to take away from this deep dive. In our sources, there's a reference to a text called the Epistle of Barnabas.
Written by early Christians in the 2nd century.
Right, and it suggests something staggering. It proposes that this 490-year countdown, this intense mathematical timer we just unpacked, was actually just a microscale fractal.
A small-scale model of a much larger computation.
Yes. Barnabas argued it was a fractal of a macro-scale computation of 7,000 years of human history, ending in a cosmic, universal Sabbath rest.
Wow.
So the question we leave you with is this. If the ancients were right about the micromath of the legal contract, are we all still unknowingly living inside the macromath today? Are we just variables in an equation that hasn't hit zero yet?
A terrifying and thrilling thought.
Something to ponder. Because the next time you look at a last will and testament or an ancient biblical text, just remember, you might think you're reading poetry, but the author, they were writing a contract to catch you on the next deep dive.